Funeral work, 1948. December 30th, 1948. T. Miles, deceased, paid. 1949, January 3rd, J. Brown, deceased, paid. January 4th, Mr. Finnegan, deceased, paid. January 4th, Miss Perry, deceased, paid. January 24th, Mrs. Sharkey, deceased, paid. January 28th, Miss Madden, deceased, paid. January 28th, Christopher Dignan, deceased, paid. January 29th, Mrs. Leonard, deceased, paid. February 2nd, Mrs. Mooney, deceased, paid. February 2nd, Mrs. Monaghan, deceased, paid. February 2nd, T. Smith, deceased, paid. February 5th, Mrs. McCabe, deceased, paid. February 8th, Mrs. Butler, deceased, paid. February 10th, Kennedy's, deceased, paid. February 11th, Mrs. McGrath, deceased, paid. February 12th, Mrs. Mooney, deceased, paid.
St. Mary's Chapel, St. Mary's Church.
February 12th, Mrs. Mitchell, deceased, paid. February 16th, Mrs. Garthland, deceased, paid. March 2nd, Mrs. T. Comiskey, deceased, paid. March 4th, Mrs. Kieran,
Gibbonstown, Orstown Chapel, Orstown,
deceased,
Patrick Cemetery.
paid. March 4th, Mrs. Smith, deceased, paid. March 6th, Master Rowan,
Hocking,
deceased, paid.
Camden,
March 6th,
House
Mr. Keenan, deceased,
Second,
paid. March 8th, Mr. Smith, deceased, paid. March 9th, Mrs. Cooney, deceased, paid.
DRL and Eric Mill,
March 13th,
Papers Insertion, Press,
paid.
Second Monday,
March 16th,
Grave Diggers,
John Cox,
Car Hire,
deceased,
Hearse Runs,
paid. March 18th, Mr. Williams, deceased,
Overstown,
paid.
Overstown Church Ground,
1949, March 26th,
Emma Terrace to St Mary's Chapel,
Miss Nally, deceased,
St Mary's,
paid.
Old at Lumley Cemetery, Habit, Hocking,
March 28th, name unrecorded, paid. April 7th, Elizabeth Smith, deceased, paid. April 15th, Peter Lee, deceased, paid. April 21st, Ellen Grahan, deceased, paid.
Kentstown Chapel,
March 24th, Marcella Riley, deceased, paid. April 28th, John Rowe, deceased, paid.
North Wall and back to Bunyan Chapel, Second Press, Chronicles,
Photographs.
April 30th, Eileen O'Sullivan, deceased, paid. May 3rd, John Cronin, deceased, paid. May 6th, Mrs. E. Duffy, deceased, paid. May 12th, Mrs. J. Kelly, deceased, paid. May 20th, Mr. McLonan, deceased, paid. May 22nd, 2 cars to New Cemetery, paid. May 28th, Mrs. Josephine Riley, deceased, paid. June 13th, Patrick Powderly, deceased, paid.
Insertions in paper.
June 18th,
Acknowledgements in the Chronicle.
Richard Fitzgerald,
First runs. Our Lady's
deceased,
Hospital. Screen
paid.
chapel. Screen.
June 23rd, Margaret Lynch, deceased, paid.
December 30th, 19.
June 24th, Joseph Brennan, deceased, paid. June 29th, Mary Garfield, deceased, paid. July 30th, Mrs. Clark, deceased,
Mr. Finnegan,
paid. June 30th, Mr. Smith, deceased, paid.
Miss Perry,
July 8th,
deceased.
Mr. Carroll, deceased, paid. July 10th, Mr. Donlan, deceased, paid. July 13th, Miss Smith, deceased, paid. July 17th, Mr. Dempsey, deceased, paid.
To Donapatrick.
July 25th, Michael Rourke, deceased, paid. August 5th, William Booth, deceased, paid. August 26th, name unknown, deceased, paid. September 25th, Mr. Ratty, deceased, paid. September, Julia Flood, deceased, paid. October 8th, Mr. Rock, deceased, paid. October 11th, John Bray, deceased, paid. October 16th, Mrs. Clark, deceased, paid. Mrs. Clark. October 21st, Mrs. Gaynor, deceased, paid. Mrs. Gaynor. November 13th, Mrs. Murphy, deceased, November 13th, paid. Mrs. Murphy, deceased, November 13th, paid. Mrs. Murphy. November 16th, paid. Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. O'Mara, deceased, paid. Mrs. O'Mara, deceased, paid. November 16th, Mrs. Curtis, deceased, paid. December 6th, Mr. W. Boyle, deceased, paid. December 26th, Michael Rourke, deceased, paid. 1950, January 3rd, Mr. Smith, deceased, paid. January 9th, Mrs. Goodwin, deceased, paid. January 18th, Paddy Kringan, deceased, paid. January 22nd, William Duffy, deceased, paid. January 26th, John Vaughy, deceased, paid.